Folks, welcome. Happy to have you here. Just a few quick thank yous and acknowledgements. The French and Indian War Society of Lake George for sponsoring this, the Ken Mark, Director of the Museum, and also Chief Cameraman in the back. And of course, all of you for coming here. I know that some of you were here at this afternoon and this morning for the Reenactments, or Sutler's Faire. It turned out to be an amazing day, quite a change from last year's 2 feet of snow that canceled the event. And of course, last night was a very successful dinner, so it's been quite a weekend, and we're happy to have Dr. Stephen Eames here this evening. I'm going to read to you the introduction that he provided, and then I'd like to say a couple of other things as well. I should introduce myself. I am Andrew Menzie, Director of Historical Interpretation here at Fort Willim Henry, and very honored to be here. Dr. Stephen Eames, Stephen C. Eames, spent 35 years as a professor of history. His research interest focuses on the impact of war on people, both soldiers and civilians. His published works include Sacrifice of Self, Nahant and the Civil War, won the American Association for State and Local History Award of Merit, and the Albert B. Corey Award, also an award for the New England Museum Association, as well as Rustic Warriors, Warfare, and the Provincial Soldier on the New England Frontier. And I have my book here. I know John Eric brought his today. Great read, and what really interested me and made me reach out to Steve was the fact that the human side behind this. I mean, a good historian, in my opinion, puts people in the shoes of the people who walk there, and a really good historian puts them in the mind of the people who he's writing about, and I think a really good historian puts you, makes you feel the emotions that person may have been experiencing at that time, and I really enjoyed that part of the book that I'm sure he's going to spend some more time talking about tonight, so thank you very much.
Well, greetings. When Andrew contacted me about this, he made a couple of little requests. He wanted something about war and winter, because the raid happened in March and so forth. Then he mentioned, well, the 250th of the War for Independence is coming. Could you tack something on at the end of it? And I said, so we're going to try to do all of that. Okay. But my focus today is on how culture and climate help us understand warfare in early America. Now, as mentioned, I wrote this book. You haven't seen this. It's a Rustic Warrior. And I found myself thrust into the historian's dispute on whether English colonists stayed European in their approach to war in the 17th and 18th century, or they adopted an American approach. I was neutral in that I see both. In terms of military structure, the militia system, and approach to large expeditions, the colonists retained an English approach to that. But out of necessity for frontier or borderland war, they became more American. And I'll explain what that means. Now, when the English colonists arrived, they were different immediately. Now, I can't give my very popular lecture on what happened when the English first came to North America, except to say that the minute they stepped off whatever famous boat they sailed on, they created a different culture. They were not aware of this, of course, but it is true nonetheless. For example, one big change is that the upper class of English society did not come. Nor really did the lowest members of English society. As I used to tell my students, if you're in the gutter begging, you don't have a lot of ambition to come across. So initially they were the middling sort who came here. And they left many restrictions of English society behind because of that. Position in English society was based on land. Did you own land? Did you rent it? If you rented it, were you a copy holder, meaning did you have a lease? Or were you a tenant at will, tenant at the will of the landlord? If you owned land, how much did you own? If you owned enough to live off the rents, then you were in the gentry class. Otherwise, you were a yeoman farmer. Many a renter came here and was granted land, and they moved up to be yeoman farmer immediately. But, at least in New England, they never got enough land to be in the gentry class. So there was a flattening out of society when they first got here that never existed back in England. In addition, there developed an understanding that you could always move up to the yeoman farmer class by getting land on the frontier. There was so much land. But there were people who occupied that land and had occupied it for centuries, and these people objected to the land being taken. But because of terrain, mainly trees, and climate, winter, and their opponents, the indigenous population, the English colonists adopted an independent approach to war that perplexed and even disgusted officers in the English army. So what about that? Terrain, trees, trees, trees. Certainly there were far more trees than in England, because in England they cut all their trees down to build ships. One historian said that when the English first came here, a squirrel could jump on a tree in Boston and go to New York and never touch the ground. But even more than that, Western European armies fought battles in open terrain. In the 17th century, you simply can't have ranks of pikes and muskets in the woods. So battles were fought in open terrain, and there was plenty of it in Europe. But in New England, there were trees, and more than that, their opponents were used to the trees. What we know of indigenous warfare before the arrival of Europeans was that it was very common. One of the principal weaknesses of the native population of North America is that they hated each other as much as they hated the English, and they could never come together because of that. So they were always fighting wars against each other. They would sometimes meet in open terrain. They would yell at each other, they'd loft arrows at each other, and a couple of guys would get hurt, and they'd say, okay, we're good, and off they go. That was it. But the coming of firearms forced a change in their culture, and they began to adopt the tactics of hunting for warfare. Now, according to Patrick Malone in The Skulking Way of War, in the 17th century, New England Indians adapted their hunting techniques to adjust to the new technology. They took on the European firearms, and they were good shots. They were used to hunting, they were used to firing at a moving target, and they often used multiple shot in their guns to increase the chance of hitting the target. I have a friend who was, I can see we have some older people. Anybody remember Rex Trailer out of Boston?
I'm from Boston.
Yeah, Rex Trailer. He had for a while, this friend of mine was his Indian sidekick. And whenever they went out, he said they'd go out to do a public display for the kids and stuff. He would always do, you know, an example of his marksmanship. And what they did is they filled the cartridges with birdshot. So he never missed a balloon. Now, the English had no experience with this. And again, we're talking about sort of a change when they came here. If I can get these sheets of paper, right? Because only the upper class in England, the gentry class, could hunt. The lower class people, the middling sort that I just mentioned who came to America, had no experience with hunting. So how did the terrain and the indigenous approach change the English in warfare? Well, it's very simple. Dispersal, cover, and independent thinking. The man most credited with bringing enlightenment to the English was Benjamin Church. Now, some historians dispute the claim. They say there are others who adopted the native way of war, saying his influence was not so widespread. But at the very least, Church understood the native way of war, and he left us descriptions of it. In King Philip's War, Church raised companies of natives as well as English. And he told his Englishmen, you watch what those guys do, and you copy them. He asked the natives why they were so successful against the English. Quote, they told him that Indians gained great advantage of the English by two things. They always took care in their marches and fights not to come too thick together, so that it was as easy to hit them as to hit a house. The other was that if at any time they discovered a company of English in the woods, they knew they were all. For the English never scattered, but the Indians always divided and scattered. This would become an important maxim for Church. Scatter, spread out, don't bunch. English tradition was to stand up and face the enemy using pike and muskets, linear tactics. That was the manly way of war. That was the honorable way of war. Church had to change that belief, that cultural belief. Church also made sure that not everyone fired at once. If all the weapons were emptied, the enemy could charge. Once when an ambushed, Church, quote, called to his men not to discharge all their guns at once, lest the enemy should take advantage of such an opportunity to run upon them with their hatchets, unquote. The European military method at the time was to fire volleys, because you're out in an open field and you spray musket balls out toward the enemy, who's also standing in ranks on the other side. That makes sense in an open terrain. It does not make sense in the woods. Church always told his men to, quote, run very thin to preserve themselves and be better able to make discovery of the enemy, unquote. On his 5th raid into Maine, he was infuriated during one action to find, quote, so many of the army in a crowd together, acting so contrary to my command and direction, exposing themselves and the whole army to utter ruin by their so disorderly crowding thick together. Had an enemy come upon them in that interim and fired a volley amongst them, they could not have missed a shot, unquote. Note this change that happened to European thinking. Before, if they were not in ranks, they were disorderly. But here, Church believes that not being scattered was disorderly. Church also ordered that when confronted with an enemy to, quote, clap down and cock their guns, unquote. They needed to take cover. And this was an individual decision on what made the best cover. Is this tree big enough to hide me? Is that rock big enough to hide me? That's independent thinking. Soldiers involved in woods warfare could not be mindless machines as European armies were. They should be inspected, Church said, by, quote, men of known judgment to see if their arms be good and they know how to use them in shooting right, at a mark, taking aim, and that they be men of good reason and sense to know how to manage themselves in so difficult a piece of service as this Indian hunting is, unquote. Note the use of the term hunting. They just said Indians were using hunting techniques, and Church is saying that's what we're doing here. And it's involved independent thinking. Captain Thomas Sterling of the 42nd Regiment Black Watch spent 12 years in North America during the last French War. He wrote to his brother in 1760 that he hoped the regiment would be sent to Germany, where the real glory on real battlefields could be won. He was very tired of the style of warfare in North America. He wrote to his brother, quote, the officers can acquire no honor in a country, whereas the New England people say every tree is a fort and every man a general, unquote. I'm going to read that again. The New England people say every tree is a fort and every man a general. Damn, I wish I had found that quote when I was writing this book. Okay, so now we come to climate. Talk about terrain, climate, winter war. Another difference between European and American warfare was winter. In Europe, warfare ended in the wintertime. Armies went into winter quarters mostly because the roads could not take the marching of thousands of soldiers and heavy supply wagons. Early on, the English colonists adopted this European way. In King William's War, the government of Massachusetts raised provincial soldiers to guard the frontier areas. They stationed men along the frontier line from Maine through New Hampshire into northern Massachusetts. And they were there from the spring until the fall. And then they brought them home. Because it's winter. You don't fight war in the wintertime. Also, you want to reduce the cost. We don't fight war in the winter, so we want to pay these guys to be there in the wintertime. And they weren't going to stay anyway. Because as we'll see, they're not going to stay that long. But the indigenous people were used to moving in the winter on snowshoes. There is evidence which indicates the Eastern Indians had long feared the New Englanders might adopt this strategy. The party which devastated York, Maine in January 1692 had been out scouting the woods for soldiers, quote, having been, as they say, advised by some of the Sandy Beach captives that the Bostoners were providing many snowshoes and designed a considerable army out this winter to disrest them at some of their headquarters, which has made them very uneasy this winter, unquote. Well, it was decided that the enemy had to be met in winter as well as the rest of the year. On February 9th, 1704, Winthrop Hilton of New Hampshire led a force of provincial soldiers on snowshoes to Pequawket in western Maine. Winthrop arrived at the village on the 16th. They found it had been deserted for about 6 weeks, and he brought his forces home again. From the standpoint of enemy killed, crops destroyed, the raid accomplished nothing. But the psychological impact was tremendous. Hilton ended his journal of the march by concluding that, quote, the winter time is the only time ever to march against the Indian enemy, both for their discovery and the health and least danger of our people, unquote. Governor Joseph Dudley was so pleased with the result, he sent a copy of Hilton's journal to the Board of Trade over in London, adding in a postscript that, quote, this march was made upon the snow a yard deep, every man in snowshoes, with 20 days' provisions upon small hand sleds, carrying each 4 men's provisions. And of 300 men in the expedition, no man returned sick. Now, Winthrop Hilton had proved it could be done. Dudley wrote in April 1704 that he had, quote, given this country as well as the Indians conviction that we can bear the frost and travel with our victuals as long as they, unquote. Acts were now passed in both New Hampshire and Massachusetts ordering frontier communities to provide snowshoes for the use of the provincial soldiers posted there. This season, observed Samuel Penhall, which before was dreaded as most hazardous, was now the time of greatest safety and of less difficulty in traveling, unquote. Winter raids became common, with Hilton out almost every winter until his death in 1710. His most successful raid occurred in January of 1707 when soldiers under his command surprised and killed over 20 Indians near Black Point, Maine. Companies of snowshoemen were raised in frontier communities. Unlike scouts taken from provincial forces from Massachusetts, which had been sent to the border, these companies were drawn from men already living there who had the experience and the economic advantage that you only had to pay them for the time they were out instead of posting them for months there. They were the most experienced men, and there was a cost saving, which all governments like. So who were these men who performed military service? This project came about when I was in graduate school. I went to the University of New Hampshire. And I had a research seminar that focused on local history. So me and my fellow graduate students invaded the Dover, New Hampshire library to try to find something to write about in this seminar. Now, I had had a lifelong interest in military history, but by the 1980s, that was being driven by the so-called new military history. The new military history was an offshoot of the historical approach developed in the late 1960s that was loosely described as, quote, history from the bottom up, unquote. It was a focus on common people rather than the elites, political leaders, etc. The new military history focused on the experience of common soldiers rather than generals and strategy and tactics. As I used to tell my students in my seminar on perception reality of war, the first day I said, if you're interested in why Napoleon lost the Battle of Waterloo, this is not the course for you. If you are interested, however, in knowing that those armies the day before the battle were marching in pouring rain and mud and arrived on the field and had to go to sleep in pouring rain on the field, that's what this course is about. So in the Dover Library, I was looking for military material, and I came across a list of men from Dover who went to the siege of Louisburg in 1745, roughly March through October of that year. I decided to find out about these men. That meant looking at birth records, marriage records, tax records, etc. There is a fancy term for this. It's called prosopography. Historians are no different than any other profession. They love jargon. Jargon is any word that comes out of a professional that you have no clue what it is. And the message is, don't try this at home. I'm a professional. And you know who the best ones at that are? Lawyers. Don't try. No. You've got to hire a lawyer to understand the jargon. Okay. Prosopography is creating a collective biography of a group of people, usually those without a personal written record. No letters, no journals, or whatever. Local historical societies in the 19th and 20th century did a wonderful job in preserving and organizing original documents. They may not have applied analysis to those documents, but they made the work of future historians so much easier. Now it's even more easier because it's on computers. And by the way, this prosopography thing, that's what things like Ancestry.com, that's what they do. Because they look at public records to find out about your ancestry. Drink here. Anyways, I was gathering this information on the men who left Dover for roughly 6 months to attack the French fortress of Louisburg. I stumbled on a list of men from Dover who performed a defensive scout for 1 week that August. And a few had the same last names as the guys who went to Louisburg. I decided to add them to the pile. What the hell? I expected that the type of man who left for 6 months would be different from the man who did a short 1-week patrol. Yet never jumped to conclusions. I was very surprised to find out that was not the case, that the men who went away for months and the men who did a short duty were the same kind of man. And perhaps even more interesting is there are a whole group of men missing from both groups. Okay, so what about that service? I just want to very quickly run over how that war was conducted. I was talking to Andrew earlier about the when I started this project, I wanted to do that search about provincial soldiers. And for those of you who read the book, that's the second half of the book. And I was going to rely on secondary histories to provide the background of the war. But as I started reading those background histories and I was researching these men, I realized I didn't agree with anything that they were saying. So now I had to write about the warfare too. because I couldn't rely on anybody else. Okay, so very quickly run over defensive, offensive approaches taken. Defensive war were patrols, garrison houses, forts. Patrols were small groups of men patrolling the outside of the frontier line. They often called it, quote, on the backs of towns, unquote. They were looking for signs of enemy raiding parties in the area in order to raise the alarm and or pursue raiders after they attacked. That 1 week company from Dover that I found, that's what they were doing. Garrison houses were fortified houses in frontier towns owned by the militia officers or often the minister. Some of them had palisades of logs and small huts. If we looked at them, they'd say, oh, that's a fort. No, it's a garrison house, but they have a palisade around it. Nearby families were assigned to a garrison and had to take shelter there when the alarm was given. This could result in 50 to 100 people crammed into that house. Often provincial soldiers, if they were stationed on the frontier, would be stationed at those houses as well. Now, forts were built along or beyond the frontier line. They were built along known invasion routes, like rivers, or on the coast. They were headquarters for provincial forces. They served as trading posts during peacetime. They represented the power and authority of the provincial governments. As for war, they often became a magnet, drawing larger French-led Indian forces to them instead of frontier towns. So that's defense. Offense, raids, and expeditions. Raids were conducted by both sides. They were small to large groups of men moving through the woods or along the coast to attack enemy targets. For the French and their Indian allies, the targets were frontier towns or those forts, like Fort Willim Henry. You didn't need a large body of men to attack a town in New England. You could do it with 20 or 30 natives. But you could also have raiding parties of hundreds to hit bigger targets. For the English, the targets tended to be the native allies of the French, particularly at the Maine, or the French communities in the French Maritimes. Now, expeditions were very large operations copying European warfare. Generally, an expedition involved numbers into the thousands, artillery, naval forces. For the English, the targets were the maritime settlements of Port Royal in Nova Scotia, and eventually Louisbourg and Cape Breton Island. And then the ultimate prize, of course, was New France itself, meaning Quebec. The New England colonies attempted to do this alone on 3 occasions. They attacked Fort Royal in 1690, Quebec in 1690, and Port Royal again in 1707. Now, they captured Port Royal in 1690, but when it came to staying and holding on to it, nobody would stay, so they sailed away. They failed in the attack on Quebec later that summer, mostly due to a powder shortage. They were waiting for powder from England, had to go, got too late, they didn't have enough powder, failure. They failed in the attack on Port Royal in 1707. Now, the failure of these early expeditions is often used as evidence of the incompetence of provincial soldiers. However, France had only one successful expedition in that whole time, and that was the one against the Fort Willim Henry up in Pemmican, Maine, in 1696. The French planned and started a couple of others intending to attack Boston and New England communities, and they all fell apart. It just wasn't easy. After 1707, what developed was an Anglo-American partnership. The colonies providing what they could, and the English providing what the colonies could not. For the colonies, they provided provincial soldiers for the attack, food for everybody, and transport ships to get the provincial soldiers and the food to the target. The English provided the Royal Navy, muskets and ammunition, regular soldiers to garrison the site if it was captured, military engineers who were trained in the mathematics of fort building and attacking forts and so forth, and finally, the money to pay for it all. It is this partnership that captured the fortress of Louisbourg in 1745 considered by New Englanders as their greatest victory in those early French wars. Okay, so let me get back to who were these provincial soldiers. Now we understand about the warfare. The vast majority of them were volunteers. Some were pressed, some hired, but mostly volunteers. They were single men of established families. They were young men serving with their fathers. They were bachelors, they were widowers. They were young men about to be married or recently married. And they were older men, men in their 40s or even older, with children approaching the age of marriage and needed to be provided for. What do we mean by that? For a son, you had to provide him land when he got married. For a daughter, you had to provide furniture and a dowry. Usually they had teenage sons who could run the farm or the business while they were gone. Missing were middle-aged men, men in their 30s with large, young families. Now, going back to those men from Dover, and I always like to say this is just a snapshot, but as a random test, it's very revealing. Now, 51 men were identified as enlisting for the Louisbourg campaign. And while they were away, 40 more spent that week in August patrolling on the backs of the towns. Of the 91 men from Dover, 17 are obscure, simply names on the roll. No records exist and their family names are not recognized as prominent in the town records, and indeed probably represented the down and outers of Dover society. Of the 51 whose ages are known, only one was under 20. 26 fell between 20 and 29, 6 were 30 to 39, and 18 were 40 or over, including 2 men who were 59 when they went off to Louisbourg. Of the 27 men whose marital status could be discovered, 8 were single, and with one exception, those who were married had either been married less than 8 years or more than 17 years. That middle range of years married, 8 to 17, was missing entirely from this group. Now, I said there was one exception, and the one exception was Sergeant Benjamin Libby, who had been married 11 years when he went to Louisbourg. But Benjamin Libby was 52 years old. And the only married man from Dover who remained at Louisbourg over the following winter. Now, a marriage at 41 suggests a second wife. But I could find no record of a first marriage for him. Staying on could also mean that his wife was dead, or maybe there was very little marital bliss back home. I don't know. Now, incentives for service included pay and possible land grants, which had helped them get independence if they were a young man, become that yeoman farmer, or for an older man, give their son that land to become that yeoman farmer. For men on the frontier was a chance to strike back at an enemy that had had them in constant apprehension, and it was escape from the humdrum of everyday life. Some did military service once, others did it more, but one thing they had in common, and the one serious weakness in the system, they would only stay for a short time. They were not professional soldiers. This was not their livelihood. They were farmers, they were fishermen, they were tradesmen. They would do a 1-week patrol, they'd go on a 3 or 4 week raid. They would go and attack Louisbourg for 6 months. But they would not stay more than a year. That was it, that was their absolute limit. Preferably much less. And this caused real problems. At Port Royal, I mentioned 1690, as I indicated, they captured the place and no one would stay. It was like, okay, you stay. No, I'm not staying, you stay. What the hell are you talking about? No, you should, no, I'm not staying. So they took everything that wasn't nailed down and they sailed away. Now what do you think the French did? Well, they just moved right back in again. Louisbourg, they captured the fortress in June of 1745, but like Port Royal in 1690, someone had to stay. Massachusetts hoped that England would send regulars to take over. Remember I mentioned that's what England would provide, is regular soldiers for garrison duty. But the English army was not only at war with France, because that was going on, but Bonnie Prince Charlie's Rebellion was happening in Scotland. There were no regular soldiers for them to send. The whole New England army was kept there, and by September there was a near mutiny. This was alleviated by letting married men go home and raising new troops back in New England to come up. And then in the following spring, things had calmed down in England and regular soldiers arrived to take over. That's why I questioned about Benjamin Libby and his marriage, because he's one of the one married guy who stayed over. So that describes provincial soldiers. What about their officers? Unlike the English system of upper-class men who purchased their commissions, New England officers rose according to experience, success, and ability, particularly on a company level. How do you raise men? Massachusetts comes in, we need to have men for this, whatever. How do you raise men? Well, the way you do it is you yourself have shown success. And by having success, maybe you're going to bring these guys home again afterwards. So it was based on reputation, not social position. But then I ran into that real problem. As I said, while initially simultaneously researching the men and reading the secondary sources on the war, I found I disagreed with those secondary interpretations. What they said about provincial soldiers did not agree with what I was finding. And I found the culprit: an over-reliance on the interpretations of professional English officers from the British Army and Royal Navy. British officers and government officials in particular viewed the provincials as ill-disciplined, unprofessional, and incompetent. General John Forbes called colonial soldiers, quote, a gathering from the scum of the worst people, an extreme bad collection of broken innkeepers, horse jockeys, and Indian traders, unquote. James Wolfe found the troops provided by the colonies, quote, in general, the dirtiest, most contemptible, cowardly dogs that you can conceive. There was no depending on them in action, unquote. Other officers believed the Americans to be, this is significant, quote, an obstinate and ungovernable people, and utterly unacquainted with the nature of subordination in general, unquote. Remember what I told you earlier about independence, independent thinking? And that's not what they were looking for in soldiers. Later historians writing those secondary sources that I was trying to reference seemed to take these observations at face value because A, these guys were eyewitnesses, they lived at the time, they saw the provincial soldiers, and B, they were professional military men, so they should know. Richard Marcus, historian, observed that, quote, in view of the preponderance of manpower, wealth, and material enjoyed by English North American colonies in their struggle with New France, the historian cannot but be impressed by the failure of the English to protect their frontiers adequately and master their northern enemies sooner than they did. This embarrassing disparity between means and accomplishment was early evident, unquote. And Edward P. Hamilton elaborated on this point even more, quote, the average provincial was a poor soldier. He could not well be anything considering his background and lack of training. Farm boys, sailors, fishermen, apprentices, and the jobless. All these were what the hurriedly raised armies drew upon to a large extent. Those who led them generally had little or no military qualifications. He was merely the leader in civilian life, the squire, the tavern keeper, or the merchant, translated overnight into military leader, unquote. These historians attempt to explain why the provincial soldier was so poor and thus seek to justify those English observations. Instead of suggesting the possibility that the regular English officers were wrong, that their cultural prejudices ran so deep they were unable to recognize the truth. English officers were, in many cases, from the upper levels of English society. They paid for their commissions. It cost anywhere from 500 to 700 pounds for the rank of ensign in an infantry regiment in the English Army. Now, ensign is the lowest level of officer. 500 to 700 pounds. A common laborer at that time made anywhere from 35 to 40 pounds a year. Even those not from the aristocracy considered themselves professionals. And by professional, I mean trained in the art of European linear tactics, with an army of common soldiers drilled and drilled to remove any independent fodder action. They felt it took 2 years to make a soldier. Now, as I indicated, no members of the upper class, the gentry nobility, had emigrated to the colonies. Therefore, in those English officers' eyes, every colonist was from the dregs of society. And they certainly didn't have the training of regular British soldiers. So obviously they were terrible soldiers. Can't even call them soldiers. When Admiral Peter Warren sent Marine Captain James MacDonald on shore during the siege of Louisbourg in 1745, the New Englanders soon tired of his finicky criticisms of their troops. I love this quote. Provincial Commander William Pepperell wrote, quote, "We were glad to get rid of him. For the most he did was to find fault that our encampment was not regular, or that the soldiers did not march as handsome as old regular troops, their toes were not turned out enough, etc." Unquote. So Pepperell told them to get the hell back on the ship. They didn't want him. So now we come to the 250th anniversary for the War of Independence. The anniversary of Lexington Concord is 4 weeks away. Boy, how lucky were those guys to have April 19th fall on a Saturday. That's great. After suffering the disastrous defeats of Lexington and Concord and Bunker Hill, General Thomas Gage observed that the New Englanders, quote, "in all their wars against the French, never showed so much conduct, attention, and perseverance as they do now," unquote. Gage, like most British officers, had always viewed the provincials with the blinders of prejudice. His surprise is understandable. But historians who disparage those provincials early on have to explain their excess at Lexington and Concord. And in their opinion, the British finally meant the true citizen soldier. James Kirby Martin and Mark Edward Lender wrote that, quote, "Gage's regulars were not fighting against unfortunates who had been dragooned into service and whose primary goal was to stay alive. They had run into propertied freeholders operating locally, actually defending hearth and home." Unquote. Now, recall what I said, that almost all the provincial soldiers were volunteers. In reality, the Minutemen at Lexington and Concord and the provincial soldiers of the French wars represent no paradox. The men the Redcoats faced on the march from Concord back to Boston were fundamentally no different from the New England soldiers who served in those earlier conflicts. John Galvin, in his book, The Minutemen, points out that the colonists on April 19th actually had more war experience than their red-coated counterparts. So many company commanders and their men had served in the last French war. Now, I want to give you just one example. He didn't make it down there, but Johnson Moulton of York, Maine, commanded the company that marched from York. When they heard about Lexington, they marched off. Johnson had served in the last French war. He was a veteran. His uncles included Johnson Harmon and Jeremiah Moulton. Both were children in York when it was attacked in 1692. Both were among the commanders of the force that attacked Norridgewock in 1724, and Jeremiah Moulton commanded a regiment in Louisbourg in 1745. Another uncle was John Harmon, who commanded York's company of snowshoemen in 1745, and every member of that snowshoe company volunteered to go to Louisbourg. For Johnson Moulton, military service was in his blood. But change would come during the War for Independence. When George Washington assumed command of the Continental Army, he insisted that it be a European-style army. And there are three reasons for this. First, Washington always admired the British Army. I don't know how many of you know, but he tried to get a commission in the British Army in the last French War, and he was denied. But he admired that army. And if he was going to come in an army, it was going to be like that one. Second, he would not abandon the coastal populated areas of the colonies. Those areas had far more open areas. They had been settled for 150 years, and a lot of trees had been cut down. Now, Charles Lee, a former general in the British Army who decided to throw in with the Americans, urged Washington to abandon the coast and retreat into the woods and the mountains where the Americans could fight like they always fought. Washington would not do that. But that meant battle would happen in more open terrain, and it's really hard to find a place to hide when there are no trees. And when you're fighting in open terrain, that means open terrain tactics, and that means linear tactics. Third, the Americans needed help from a European power. They needed the kind of support that England used to provide. As I earlier indicated, remember the English provided the Royal Navy and muskets and powder and regular soldiers and military engineers and money. The Americans needed all of that, but they weren't going to get it from the English. They needed somebody else. And a European power would be more likely to support the Americans if they saw a reflection of themselves. If they saw a formal army fighting and not people running around like a bunch of wild Indians in the woods. And of course, France would be the new partner who provided all those things that I just talked about. But as I also indicated, linear tactics required extensive training. It isn't about independent thinking. It isn't about finding cover. It's following orders and firing volleys. And that takes time. Remember I said the British said it took 2 years to make a soldier. So Washington demanded and received from Congress a 3-year enlistment, 1777. Now, recall the weakness of the provincial system was time in service. A farmer could not spend 3 years away from the farm. And so that changed, that 3-year enlistment changed the Continental Army, and the Continental Army attracted the same kind of men that were in the British Army. They were young, they were unattached, they were out of work, and they could commit to 3 years. Particularly if dangling at the end was 100 acres of land somewhere. So where does this leave us? Well, the impact of culture and climate forced a change to warfare for the English colonists. They adopted the way of war that the indigenous people used: cover, dispersion, independent thinking. And climate, particularly winter, forced them to change from the European approach. At the same time, the cultural differences represented by English Army officers led to those officers to disparage Americans as soldiers. But it just wasn't true. And those English officers found that out on April 19, 1775. Thank you. So I got the winter and the war for independence.
Yeah, well, you made it sound like it was going to be hard. I don't think it certainly didn't come across that way. Thank you, but I'm sure he'd be honored to take some questions if anyone has them. I'd pass around the mic, but
We don't have one.
can't.
When the forces left New England for Louisburg, did they go water route?
Yeah.
Okay.
No ships.
So
That was it.
they could avoid Fort Anne and Bay of Fundy.
Yes, yes, and that's what I mean. It was, they would, the Royal Navy provided protection from the French Navy up there at Louisburg. But it's private ships that the government would hire to carry the men and the food and everything else up there.
So the English didn't devise snowshoes, they learned it from the Indians?
Pretty much, yeah. Like I say, they still, you know,
They didn't have any in
they
Britain?
didn't have as much snow over in England that they had to adopt. It's not to say that they didn't have some things in Europe, Northern Europe. They had snowshoes in North, you know, like in Norway and those places they had those. But, you know, England is a different climate than Norway, and they just weren't used to that. And again, it's just, you know, oh, it's winter. You go into winter quarters, you don't do anything in wintertime, it's cold. So, other questions?
Steve, what kind of influence did the scalp bounties in New England colonies have on the armies that were built during colonial times?
Well, that comes into play with those raiding parties that were sent out. Scalping the history of scalping in historical writing is interesting. Because it used to be, it was the Europeans that introduced scalping to the Indians, you know, because the Europeans were nasty. No. They have found skulls that predate Columbus, that have the markings of knives, whatever, around the skull. What the Europeans added was the idea of paying for them. That's what they added. And they had a whole system in Massachusetts, developed a whole system about if you were under the pay, if you were being paid as a soldier and you took a scalp, then you got so much money. But if you agreed to go out without pay, you got a lot more for a scalp. And so they were trying to save money for the government. They thought the more adventurous types, people like John Lovewell, yeah, maybe they want to go out and do scalp hunting because they can make a lot more money that way if we don't pay them. So it's, you know, on both sides, French and English. I don't want to say that the French were paying for scalps too. Although they finally had to ask for the scalp in 2 years because it was, the indigenous people found it was very simple to take a big scalp and cut it in half. I got 2 scalps. Okay, how about both ears too?
Did the French seem more adaptable in terms of, you know, learning what we would call guerrilla warfare or something like that from their experience in North America? They were vastly outnumbered, obviously, in the French and Indian War by the British. But did the French apply the lessons of North America to other conflicts in other parts of the world?
That I'm not sure that they did. But what I was thinking where you were going with this is something that I actually... How many here know René Chartrand? Okay. I put poor René on the spot. I think it was the first conference of this type that they had at Fort Ticonderoga. Because in my research, I came to the conclusion, because and particularly Canadian historians love to talk about the superiority of the Canadians in knowing woods warfare to the English. They were superior, they knew this stuff. I found that, like the snowshoe companies and the Englishmen were going out on these long distance scouts and so forth by themselves without native support. Now, sometimes they had native guides, pilots they called them. But they were going out there as essentially a block of Europeans out in the woods. And in the research, I couldn't find an example of Frenchmen by themselves doing that. They were very good at accompanying the natives, who were the experts on this. Let me hear that. They knew all about this stuff. And so what you have coming down to attack New England are French-led Indian raiding parties. So the vast number are natives, and you've got a handful of French guys who go along with them. So I asked René, I said, can you give me an example of just Frenchmen going on a raid to attack New England? No. So I I'm not sure that that old belief holds true. It's not to say that these guys, they could keep up with the natives, they knew that stuff. But to say that they were superior to the English who were going out by themselves and doing this, I don't know. I think that, I'm not here to say anything definitive about that. I think the jury's out, and I think there's a little bit in the past, a little bit of Canadian pride that was sneaking into that interpretation. Oh, our guys were much better than the English at this. Like, prove it. Prove it. And you haven't been able to prove it.
Anyone else? Well, thank you again, Steve, and thank you all for coming for this wonderful presentation.